For decades, Kaliningrad has been the Kremlin's ace in the hole, a small, heavily fortified slice of Russian territory wedged between NATO nations, loaded with missiles, and hyped as the flashpoint where any war with the West would begin. But today, that ace looks more like a ticking time bomb. Behind the parade of threats, parades, and decisive responses, something has gone very wrong inside Russia's westernmost fortress. Putin's grip on Kaliningrad, once unshakable, is slipping. And the louder Moscow yells about NATO aggression, the clearer it becomes that Russia is terrified of losing control of its own outpost. Kaliningrad has long been described as a dagger aimed at Europe's heart, home to the Baltic Fleet, Iskander missile systems, and Russia's early warning radar eyes on NATO. In theory, it's a bastion of power. In reality, it's a fortress slowly choking in isolation. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the Kremlin believed it could intimidate Europe back into obedience. Instead, NATO grew larger, stronger, and more united. Finland joined. Sweden followed. And suddenly, Kaliningrad, once the Kremlin's strategic jewel, became an island completely surrounded by NATO territory. Every map that once comforted the Kremlin now looks like a trap. Rather than admit vulnerability, Moscow doubled down. Its diplomats bark about Western encirclement. State television insists that Russia will crush anyone who dares touch Kaliningrad. And Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Putin's most loyal mouthpiece, keeps spinning the same tired line, that the West has declared war on Russia. It's not diplomacy, it's desperation in disguise, a public performance meant to hide just how exposed that fortress truly is. Whenever the Kremlin feels cornered, it doesn't send tanks. It sends talking heads. Lavrov's speeches at the United Nations and G20 summits are less about convincing foreign diplomats and more about reassuring Russians back home that their empire isn't shrinking. Each time he warns of total hybrid war, he's not describing a military threat, he's describing Moscow's paranoia. Independent analysts in Russia, few as they are, see it clearly. Artem Dikarev, host of one of the last Russian YouTube channels that dares to question the Kremlin, calls Lavrov's rhetoric the noise of fear. Kaliningrad, he says, has become the perfect mirror of Russia's insecurity, a territory that looks powerful on paper but bleeds influence every year. Inside Russia, propaganda can still drown out that truth. 2/3 of Russians get their news from state television. Every anchor, every segment, every headline is scripted to show Russia as the eternal victim, surrounded by NATO monsters, always noble, always under attack. But Kaliningrad doesn't buy that story as easily anymore. In cities like Baltiisk and Savitsk, people scroll Telegram channels that quietly repost European news in Russian. They see the difference. They see roads across the border improving while there's crumble. They see supermarkets in Poland stocked with food while prices back home explode. Propaganda works best in darkness, but Kaliningrad is surrounded by light. Unlike most of Russia, the exclave isn't plugged into Moscow's daily reality. Its streets, shops, and schools look more European than Siberian. Before the war, thousands of residents crossed into Poland or Lithuania every week for work, groceries, or medical care. They used euros, watched Polish TV, and often spoke more Lithuanian than Muscovite slang. That connection with Europe has deepened the divide. While the mainland chants, NATO is coming, Kaliningraders see NATO flags on the horizon and don't flinch. They see stability, not threat. Economically, they're paying the price for Moscow's aggression. Sanctions have cut supply lines. Tourism has vanished. Imports crawl through narrow trade corridors, and every month prices rise while salaries stagnate. The exclave that once bragged about being Russia's window to Europe has become its economic pressure cooker. Even the ports that once bustled with foreign cargo now sit quiet. Shipping companies avoid Russian docks. Insurance costs for vessels entering Russian waters have tripled, and the Baltic Fleet, once a symbol of maritime dominance, has turned into a relic, expensive to maintain, limited in reach, and strategically exposed. Power is the next crisis. Kaliningrad's electricity still flows through the same grid as the Baltic states, but that grid is about to be unplugged from Russia entirely. By next year, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania plan to sync with Europe's energy system, leaving Russia's section, and by extension Kaliningrad, disconnected. The Kremlin claims it has backup plants ready, though satellite imagery and OSINT reports suggest many are only partially operational. If those fail, Kaliningrad could face rolling blackouts within months of the Baltic disconnection. That prospect terrifies Moscow, because you can't project power from a city running on diesel generators. Even worse, once that link is severed, Kaliningrad will rely almost entirely on sea shipments of fuel, shipments that could be halted within days by a simple naval blockade or even by shipping insurers withdrawing coverage. For NATO planners, that's leverage. For the Kremlin, it's a nightmare they can't admit out loud. Every time NATO reinforces Poland's border or deploys new surveillance systems near the Suwalki Gap, the narrow 60-mile corridor separating Kaliningrad from Belarus, the Kremlin screams about provocation. But it's not provocation. It's preparation. NATO doesn't need to invade Kaliningrad to neutralize it. In a real war, precision strikes could silence its air defenses and missile sites before Russian commanders even realize what's happening. That's not bravado. It's simple geography. Kaliningrad is too small, too surrounded, and too exposed to survive without instant escalation. U.S. Army Europe Commander General Chris Donahue said last year that NATO could capture Kaliningrad in a time frame unheard of. He wasn't boasting. He was stating a fact the Kremlin dares not repeat. That statement wounded Moscow's pride, because NATO doesn't need to shout to prove readiness. It simply trains, coordinates, and builds. Every NATO exercise in Poland or Lithuania quietly reminds Russia that the balance of power has shifted for good. To prove its strength, Russia is now building one of its strangest monuments to insecurity, a massive circular radar array just 25 kilometers from Poland's border. Satellite images show a vast antenna complex under construction, likely designed to track NATO aircraft and missiles across the Baltic. Officially, it's defensive. Unofficially, it's panic in concrete form. Russia is spending millions to build a watchtower it hopes will scare NATO, but NATO isn't scared. Poland and Lithuania are upgrading their own detection systems, knowing that one missile barrage could turn that radar into molten scrap. Even pro-Kremlin bloggers can't explain how it helps. If it were truly effective, Moscow wouldn't need to shout about it. But to Russian state TV, it's proof that Russia is still strong. To NATO, it's proof that Russia is losing confidence. It's the same paradox that defines modern Russia. The more the Kremlin insists it's powerful, the clearer its weakness becomes. Kaliningrad's residents feel that contradiction every day. They hear Lavrov's threats and roll their eyes. They see new checkpoints on the border, not as signs of protection, but as symbols of isolation. In 2023, an unofficial online referendum, banned by Moscow, yet accessed by nearly 100,000 locals, asked a dangerous question. Should Kaliningrad remain under Russian control? Over 70% voted for independence. The Kremlin dismissed it as fake, but the message was unmistakable. Even inside Russia's most militarized region, loyalty is crumbling. These people aren't rebels waving NATO flags. They're exhausted citizens watching their future vanish behind propaganda. They know NATO doesn't need to bomb Kaliningrad. The Kremlin is destroying it from within, economically, socially, and psychologically. Russia's problem isn't just military, it's emotional. Putin built his image around pride, restoring a great Russia, reviving the empire that Stalin once held through fear. Losing Kaliningrad would shatter that illusion. It would prove that Moscow's reach no longer extends across Europe's borders. That's why Lavrov's rants matter. Each threat, each accusation, each claim that NATO is plotting an attack is an act of self-preservation. He's not trying to convince Washington or Brussels. He's trying to convince Russians that their empire is still alive. But inside the Kremlin, panic is real. Even military analysts close to the government quietly admit that Kaliningrad's strategic value has turned into a liability. It costs billions to defend. It's exposed on all sides. And every day it depends more on NATO's restraint than on Russia's strength. If the war in Ukraine continues bleeding Moscow's economy, the Kremlin may quietly downgrade Kaliningrad's status. Fewer troops, less investment, and more propaganda to fill the void. That radar array could stand half-finished, another monument to failure like so many Soviet megaprojects before it. Meanwhile, NATO will keep tightening its network across the Baltic. More joint exercises, upgraded bases in Poland and Lithuania, expanded surveillance over the sea. For Moscow, the optics will be brutal. Every NATO jet that flies near Kaliningrad's airspace reminds Russians that the fortress is no longer theirs to boast about. It's a cage. And for the people of Kaliningrad, that cage grows smaller each month. You can't eat propaganda. You can't heat your home with pride. When Lavrov talks about sacrifice for the motherland, the average Kaliningrader hears, "Get ready to suffer for our mistakes." Putin's system depends on control, of territory, of narrative, of fear. Kaliningrad undermines all three. It's geographically trapped, informationally porous, and ideologically restless. The Kremlin's loudest voices can't drown that out forever. When NATO speaks confidently about defending Europe, Moscow hears humiliation. When the Baltic states cut off Russian power links, Moscow feels isolation. And when Kaliningrad's own people start questioning whether they want to remain Russian, Moscow feels something it hates most of all: irrelevance. That's the real story behind the so-called Kaliningrad threat. Not NATO expansion, not Western aggression, but a Russian empire slowly realizing that its frontline fortress may soon stop being Russian at all. For now, the world watches a chessboard that hasn't moved yet. NATO builds quietly and methodically. Russia screams loudly and desperately. And in the middle sits Kaliningrad, once the proud symbol of Soviet power, now trembling at the edge of Europe. History has a sense of irony. The exclave once designed to project Russian dominance may end up proving its decline. And the louder the Kremlin shouts about strength, the clearer it becomes that the echo we're hearing from Kaliningrad isn't power, it's fear. If you found this breakdown useful, hit subscribe and stay with us for more deep dive analysis into Russia's unraveling influence across Europe.